Good evening, and thank you all for coming to our fourth installment of our estate planning workshops, our fourth and final installment. I hope you guys have had a chance to go back and review, installment 1, 2, and 3, where we talked about wills, trust, and just planning for your end of life situations. Tonight, we're gonna talk about pre-needs and, end of life matters. Um, Ms. Christy Pendleton Harrison, owner and CEO of Harris Funeral Home, is going to be our speaker this evening. Christy?
Thank you, Ms. Langston. And hello, everyone. It's good to see you out this evening to discuss this very important matter of funeral service planning, legacy planning, and how this works throughout the process. All right, so there will be a discussion, so you may ask me questions in between the topics, and we will go from there. So let's get started. End of life matters. So when we think about death, we think sometimes that this is one of the worst time periods in our life to lose a loved one, someone that is very close to us, especially if it's sudden, or if there's been a long illness. It is hard to come to grips with death. One of the first things that we learn as funeral directors is to call it what it is. Death. We often use terms as passed away. They've moved on, a homegoing. And yes, those things do bring us some comfort, but death is final. It helps us to process. So it's very important to lean into what is happening at the time. So to prepare for that, to prevent the wanting to have other terms or making things easier for us to cope with death, it is important to pre-plan for it, to prepare for it. Because that is one of the best things, one of the greatest things that you can do to provide yourself and your family peace. And allow you to go through the grief process and to begin to understand that you will have all of these emotions, but you also have to handle the business of death because it involves quite a bit of our business that things that we've accumulated through the years, and it will be a very important part of our estate. So preparing and planning for death is very important. Next slide. So we also want to make sure that we prepare to have those conversations. The conversation with our children. How early do you begin to talk about death with your children? For us, because especially in the African American community, death is very real, very close to us because we plan for things like services, and we have church families that we associate with. And well, maybe not as much as we used to, but yet and still, you have those neighbors that you lose, and children see those things. So to prepare them as early as they can understand it, I usually suggest maybe about between 11 and 12 years old, to begin to discuss those things that, yes, there is an end to life, and these things do happen. And here's what we do to prepare for those things. Next. So we've already talked about how we plan for everything else. We plan for births. We plan when we're getting married. Most of us plan through education, especially I look at my own son as a junior in high school, looking at different colleges and universities and what he wants to do as he gets older, preparing for life. And so, because we do plan and prepare for everything else, this should also be planned for. What type of disposition you want. Disposition meaning a burial or a cremation. So those are the options that we have when we begin to prepare and plan for death. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about a prearrangement. So here are things that you want to make sure that you have when you are planning to prearrange your service. You may walk into a selected funeral home. There are many options. You can find information online. You can visit funeral homes. They will schedule an opportunity for you to visit with a life insurance agent as well as a funeral director. And they will begin to ask you questions. And here are some of the things that you'll need. First of all, vital statistics are very important when we talk about death, because a death certificate requires all of the information. And in the state of Oklahoma, if you do not have all of these things completed on a death certificate, it will not be certified. Which means if there's anything unknown, you will not be able to get a registered certified copy of a death certificate. Those things are a place of birth. Many do not know their mother's maiden name. People would not believe that. But share that information with your children and others. You know, occasionally some families may outlive, parents outlive children, and you have to leave your information in the hands of a cousin or niece and nephew, and sometimes just a family friend. So all of that information is important to have. A mother's maiden name. Also, your personal address. You cannot use a P.O. box. So you must use an address, a physical address to where you live on your death certificate. Other things for veterans. Veterans require a DD-214 in order to have the services that the United States provides for them. For that veteran, it may be a burial plot or how many years, and if they were honorably discharged. So this is very important. Here in Oklahoma City, our regional veterans office is located on Northwest 8th Street, that's 8th and Hudson, in the federal building. And there's a regional office where you can actually go in and get a DD-214 if required, if you do not know where your paperwork is. The next slide, please.
Question. So do you get that, when do you get that deed, whatever, do you get that at the time of death or before? Or?
This is for your pre-planning, so you want to have this before. Yes, yes, you can walk in and make that request.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, question?
So when you're pre-planning, you basically are actually getting all the information that you need for a death certificate?
Yes. So this is these are the first steps in your pre-planning. So you want to have all vital statistic information, your social security number, your date of birth, where you were born. A lot of times people do not have that information. So in order to ensure that you receive a certified death certificate, those are the things that you will need. Question?
In pre-planning, do you have to pre-plan everything, or can you just pre-plan certain steps, or up to, and I'm sure you'll probably go over.
And you can pre-plan certain steps, or you can select things that you want to do. But I would suggest that you follow these steps, because in its entirety, then it relieves some of that stress on the family.
Okay.
So the next portion is, of course, merchandise. So we can talk about if someone wants to be funeralized, not memorialized, there's a difference. So when we talk about a funeral service, a traditional service is a visitation, public visitation, which is people being able to come to the funeral home or to the church and have one last look at their loved one in a natural state. And then the next thing is a memorial service. A memorial service, the body is not present. So this is maybe a service where you just want to celebrate a person's life and not have the physical remains there. And it can be in the case of cremation, or some may just opt to do this and have a direct burial. That's also another term that we use. Direct burial is you go from the hospital to the funeral home, you're prepared, and then the following day, within 24 hours, you are buried. So that is a direct burial. Yes. And because in the state of Oklahoma, the embalming process is only required if you are having public visitation. So within 24 to 48 hours, you are allowed to just go directly to the cemetery for a burial. Question?
Is there a downside to not embalming?
The only downside to not embalming is public visitation, because for the health and safety of the general public.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, ma'am. You may get into this a little bit later, but I know that people often say to cremate, or cremations are more budget friendly than just burying someone. However, when you do, they can become more costly when you do have like the public visitation or the other pieces. Are you going to talk about like the cost difference, or like how like, is that really true or not?
Yes, so we will discuss costs and the difference between, now we just talked about disposition, burial, or cremation. So those options are just a point of what we are going to do with the remains. Now, the other things that you just mentioned, the funeral service, a visitation, other items that can be purchased, and we're going to talk about those things when we talk about the merchandise. Yes, there are costs involved, and no, cremation is not a less expensive option if you opt to do all of those things.
So, in order to have a funeral, you have to be embalmed. So, if you wanna have a funeral service with no kneeling, would you have to still embalm the body?
That would require direct burial if you are not going to have any service.
Well, if you wanna have a service, but no kneeling, you still have to embalm?
If the body is going to be present, it must be embalmed. So let's talk about, those pre-arrangement items. Some of those we've just mentioned, a casket style. So there are so many casket options. We have the caskets that, what we call a non-sealer, which is a casket that does not have a gasket that will air close the casket to lock it and seal it, a sealed casket. And then you have those things that you may require at the cemetery, which is a vault or a liner. A concrete liner is the minimum requirement for most cemeteries. There are still some small family country cemeteries that do not require a liner, but most do because of the perpetual care for the lawn care and things like that. We do not want the ground to sink, in those vaults and liners help support that. So that is the reason that you have them. And then cremation urns are available, and also cremation vaults, because you can bury the remains after cremation. Question?
When you talked about the difference in a coffin or casket being sealed or unsealed, I didn't know that there was I didn't know you had an option on that. What would be the purpose of whether the other, why would you only want one? Why do you want, what's, you know what I'm saying?
Yes. So, great question of why choose a sealed casket versus a non-sealed, and a vault versus a concrete box. Anyone remember, when they exhumed the body of Medgar Evers? And he was in pristine, almost perfect condition. Anytime you use a sealed casket and a vault, it preserves everything for almost time to a time. So with a professional embalmer, and of course, those items that I just mentioned, it will leave the body generally in that same condition without decomposition. That's the reason and the difference. And if you remember the floods in New Orleans, if anyone remembers the caskets that were floating, those were all sealed caskets. So there is a difference. And for peace of mind, of course, is the number one reason. But again, if anyone ever has to be exhumed, if a body has to be moved to another place, I know that from personal experience, my family in Carter County, they moved the entire family cemetery. So, of course, most of those from the early 1900s, there was nothing to actually move. So you have those things where the casket, vault, cremation urns are important. So we also talked about the traditional funeral service versus the memorial service. And there are additional items which we call cash advance items. Normally, the funeral homes provide services, but not necessarily the work, such as flowers, a program, or what we call a memorial folder. Those things are services offered by others, but they're placed on the funeral bill because you want to pay for everything in one place. So you have to remember that you have to consider, do I want a certain type of flower? Do I want hymns or certain types of music sung at my service or played at my service? Now, of course, videos are very popular, video tributes. So a picture selection. I discussed with someone earlier that Normally, when families come into the funeral home, that's one of the first things they want to discuss or do. They want to talk about mom or dad's photos and what they did and what they loved most about them and what they want to place in the program and their favorite song. But we also have to get back to the business of funeral service and the cost. So we've talked about the casket, non-sealer, or the sealer. And of course, there's going to be a cost difference, correct? So we want to be prepared for that. Minimum, a casket that is a non-sealer, and I'm just speaking from my experience. A non-sealer casket usually begins in the price of about $1,350, $1,350, and can go up to something that some call a 14 karat gold lined casket, which is at now $70,000. So you have those price differences. So you want to think about what's important to you. If you want to spend that money, or if you'd like something, of course, more reasonable. We talk about casket styles. I know that other than metal caskets, you remember people would always say, bury me in a pine box. Honey, pine boxes are expensive. So when we start to talk about wood, hardwoods are very expensive caskets. So we need to be prepared for things like that. And also instructions. We have many people that are transplanted from other states, countries. And so you have to also be prepared to tell them, send me home, wherever that is. It requires a permit to transport you across state lines, as well as embalming is required, and other services of the funeral home that is in or on this side of wherever death occurs. But also the receiving funeral home, you have to be prepared for their costs. So if we are talking about what we call shipping costs, that is a requirement for us to either send the decedent by plane, or a family member may ask or request, well, do you mind driving them to that state? And normally, there is a fee after usually about 60 miles. There's a cost incurred when funeral homes travel to other towns, cities, or states. And of course, the receiving funeral home will have their charges for receiving the remains. If there's going to be a visitation there, so you may have a visitation, for instance, here in Oklahoma, and say you're being received somewhere, say in New York, and you're going back to New York. Well, they'll have a requirement there that you also pay their charges for their visitation fees and whatever other services or offerings that you have there at their location. And then let's talk about a final resting place. So we know that many cemeteries will sell plots, and they also have a cost after death, which is opening and closing of the grave. Opening and closing is very expensive. And it can be anywhere from $1,200 to $2,700, depending on the cemetery, and some even higher if it's on a weekend. Because on a Saturday, which I call that National Funeral Day. Because we used to, not as much anymore, would often have Saturday funerals because most people were off work. But for us and staff, that is overtime. So the costs go up. So there are higher costs on the weekend. Next, once you pay for the plot or pay for the opening and closing, some used to let you pay for that in advance. Let me share that as well. So if you check with your cemetery, they may allow you to lock that cost in and pay for it now. So that's always a good option to check with wherever you want to be buried to see if they want to. We'll let you do that. Question?
Yes, sorry, hi. My question is, kind of to this point, but separate. For those who may have been like prior military, like how much does that play a part in what's covered, as far as funeral expenses, shipping, things like that?
So for, it's different for veterans. The question was about military shipping or burial.
Yes.
So it's different for active duty and also for veterans. Now, I can speak to veterans, those that have no disability or not receiving any disability do not die in a VA facility, such as a hospital or a VA nursing home. So they receive a different benefit, and it's gauged about 40% of what they receive from what they are receiving currently as disabled veterans. Now, for just a veteran that served in the military, they do not receive any of those services. They receive their military honors, which is a flag, and because of our current situation, and after COVID, most bases are scheduling services out for about 3 weeks. So it is very hard to get into a national cemetery currently. But all veterans are allowed to be buried in a national cemetery as long as they were honorably discharged. They receive no other funds other than those rights. So you would have had to be a disabled veteran to receive additional benefits, and they will pay for things like transportation and shipping, of course. So our 2 cemeteries, and they are activating a 3rd near Ardmore, are in Elgin, Oklahoma, and Fort Gibson, near Muskogee, Oklahoma. Any other questions?
I just want to be clear, based on your question also. So in order to find out exactly what they pay for, is that where we go to the Northwest 8th place in Hudson?
So that's where that's the regional VA office.
Okay.
They can pull up all of the information for the veteran and let you know what they qualify for. And again, people that just served in the military without any disability, and were honorably discharged, those are the only things that they can receive. Are to be buried in the National Cemetery and the military honors. Next slide, please. All right, so we've already talked about planning your funeral arrangements can lessen the stress. And also, the most important thing is reducing financial burdens on loved ones. We are living in a time of GoFundMe and different things to pay for funeral service. So one thing that I suggest, first thing, is check your policies, your life insurance policy. The difference between life insurance and accidental death that does not pay if there's not an accident. Many people think that it will cover costs still because of death. No, only in case of an accident. So a whole life policy, most whole life policies are great to have because they also build cash value. And I suggest that if you have children or young people, I suggest that you get whole life policies because that cash value begins to build. And it also supports and helps build wealth. If you keep that whole life policy through your golden years, you can use that cash value to pay for that policy. You really no longer have to pay for it, for the premiums. So it's a really great option. The next option would be a term life policy. And you can get term life from anywhere from 10 to some 30, 40 years. Term lives the premium is less expensive, but it's only for that time period. So if you don't renew it or roll it over into a whole life policy, that term life policy does end after whatever that year anniversary is. So it could be a 10-year, 5-year. And then we do plan for funerals using insurance. So you can select all of those things that we talked about, that we've discussed, and you can pre-plan and pay for those things ahead of time. They are insurance funded. You can pay them out in payments, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And you can also, what we do is a single pay. So what that does is you can pay for it all at once. And then it begins to have just a small bump in it of interest so that it can keep up with the cost of inflation, but nothing is keeping up with inflation right now, so. But that is the reason to do a pre-planned burial plan. So you can also pay for all of those items. You can pay for the casket. You can also pay for that cemetery plot. And you can put money in for opening and closing, even if they tell you we're not gonna lock in that cost, but you can still pay for it and hope that that interest will build up enough to where over time, you can also have that paid for. Yes.
What happens if, I always thought about this, like for instance, I get an insurance policy for my grandson, okay, and I pay on it for years and years and years. I die, and later on, 3 years later, my son, and so that means that no one's paying on it anymore. And three years later, my son dies, and they say, well, you know, Mama had a insurance policy for him. Is it?
So
What happens? I bet that happens sometimes.
it does. So often what will happen, again, if it's whole life and it has some cash value, that cash value can continue to pay those premiums.
Okay.
And what will happen is that at a certain point, it will stop that policy, finalize it to where, hey, it may reduce the actual amount of the policy, but it could become a paid up policy at that point. Yes.
I have two questions now, kind of based on her question. So, and I'll just use myself as an example. So I have a life insurance policy on myself, and I have one on my son, and he's a minor, but I have him as the beneficiary. But I have my brother as a kind of like the contingency, but I kind of want to know know, maybe you're gonna get into it, cause I know it kinda gets into like the estate versus, you know, putting it into a trust and all of that, like, should I pass before he turns 18?
The very first thing that I would say is, for adults that have minors on insurance policies, change that immediately. You never know what may happen, and if it becomes necessary to use that policy for your funeral service, we would not be able to use it. A minor cannot sign for it, anything,
Okay.
because it's contractual. So, that would be my first suggestion. If you know anyone that has a minor as a beneficiary on an insurance policy. And then again, look at your documents regularly and update them. Do I have time? I just want to tell a quick story about that. Sitting at the arrangement conference table, I have a wife who's been married to her husband for over 30 years. She hands me an insurance policy. He had previously been married. He never changed the beneficiary on his insurance policy. And it all went to the ex-wife. And she was devastated. Well, because all of his benefits were in the ex-wife's name.
I know someone who did that.
So the retirement, the life insurance, which life insurance is for the living. Let me say that first. Because when you leave others behind, and that's part of our legacy planning. When you leave others behind, that is to support the family. So this is why it's so important to prepare and plan and pay for your burial ahead of time if you can afford to. I know a lot of people cannot, but if you are in a planning mode, this would be one of the things that I would suggest, is that you pay for your funeral in advance and cover those costs and leave your life insurance to your family. I also say leave something to, if you are a church board, leave something to your church, because they have just lost a tither. So I know from experience that when you lose several church members and you often say, wow, what happened? We're reduced in funds. Well, that's because you lost several of your tithing members. But if you leave something to help support the church, leave something for your family, I would always suggest that when you're doing your life insurance policy, that you do 3 to 4 times your salary, your yearly salary, and multiply that times 4. So that you have sufficient amount to at least help build some wealth as well for your children or the spouse that you leave behind, because you could become a single income home. Question?
So if you pay for your funeral in advance, once you, let's say you don't pass for another 5-10 years and costs go up, will your family have to pay like the difference in price from when you first bought the policy?
Okay, that's a great question. If you pay for your funeral in advance, is the cost locked in, or are you responsible for the additional costs? You are responsible for the additional costs. There are no guaranteed funeral service policies. So there used to be, but we do not have those any longer. So that's why it's insurance funded. And so it has the interest that's built in. So as you pay on that service, again, you pay for a prepaid burial plan either in a single payment, 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years. Those are usually the options.
So it's an actual insurance policy,
Yes.
it's not a burial, or it's a
It is
burial
a burial
insurance
policy because you select all of your merchandise. So it tells you in that policy that this is the particular casket that you have selected. This is the vault that you have selected. I'd also like to add, death certificates. Well, currently, when I started in this industry, death certificates were $5 each. So, we know that's not the cost anymore. So, when we discuss those things, again, it's important to make sure that all of the items that you think you will need, and remember, you'll probably need a death certificate for just about everything. Of course, there are some you have to take the certified copy in, they'll make their own copies and give it back to you. But for others, like your insurance company, they need that certified copy of the death certificate for retirement. They need that certified copy of the death certificate.
So the policy is based on a certain amount, or is it based on the things that you choose?
It is based on the current cost of that funeral
Things
today.
that you choose, okay.
Yes,
So I
so,
can choose 200 programs, a casket spray, tube spray, like all of that, and just pay them.
yes, if you wanted to choose, you said, again, I want a traditional funeral. So let's go through what, we call a general price list. In a funeral home, you come in, you sit down, what are the current costs of the funeral for your funeral home? They hand you a general price list. The professional services of the funeral director and staff, that's a part of that general price list. The cost for embalming, the cost for transportation, for making the removal or pickup of your loved one to bring them into the care of the funeral home. There is a charge for that. There is a charge for the nice hearse, for if someone requires or would like a family vehicle, to take them to the funeral. So those are costs incurred, and each item is listed on that general price list. It's a requirement from the Federal Trade Commission. So it has to be listed out and tell you exactly what that cost is for and those additional items. So the type of casket that you select, if you want a vault or an urn. So all of those items can be placed on the bill, whatever the current cost for those things are. And you can estimate the cash, value of the other items that we discussed, programs, flowers, things like that, to make sure that they are covered. So I may increase that cost by 5% and say, hey, we need to add this in just because of what it may cost 20 years later. So, question?
It sounds like that general price list is an open thing that you have to have. Is it on your website?
So you are able to go in and pick them up from, you can ask your local funeral home for a general price list and they can provide you with one.
I kind of want to go back to your scenario that you gave about the young lady, the wife. In this situation where, the wife is there and it comes out that on the life insurance policy, it goes to one person, but they have a will, and that leaves it to whoever. How does that work?
You would need to speak with your legal representation about anything that deals with the will. Next slide. Okay, so we've already talked about the wide range of prices, and most funeral homes are
very open and willing to share that information with you. And again, I will compare. I am a smart shopper, and so I just don't go in and purchase things without knowing what I am getting. And again, I say it like that, but that is a part of doing business even in death. So you need to know what you're paying for and why. And to pre-plan and you have all of the information ahead of time is just very important because death is, again, a very emotional time. And when someone that loves you so much, it is hard for them to do business and grieve. So it's very stressful, and this will relieve a lot of that if everything is in place. Next slide, please. Okay, so this just shares the information about what we've discussed already about the prearranged funeral and setting that up to pay for it. And there is a rate based on age. Unfortunately, it is funded through life insurance. So it is grouped according to your age, so the premium may be higher based on age. So those are things that you also need to consider when preparing and planning for a prepaid funeral.
I'm sorry, I'm reading a slide. So it says that, so let's say I purchased the pre-needs insurance plan from you, and in the next 5 years I'll move to Dallas, and I'm in Dallas, would I could use that
So
policy?
if you were living in one place and moved to another place and died in another city, all things are transferable. Okay, do not let anyone tell you that you are locked into a specific funeral home. You are not. So you can, that is your money, you pay the premium. And the only way that, and this has happened, that people will assign, and what I mean by assign is that they will turn it over or put it in the name or list a funeral home as a beneficiary on a policy. And that does happen often. So you will have someone go in and say, I wanna use my life insurance policy to pay for my funeral, and not realizing or understanding that they have written their entire life insurance to the funeral home and made them beneficiary, assigned that policy to them, irrevocably assigned. So you can't take it back. And when that happens, that money belongs to them. So even if there is someone that remains, there's a living, child, or say they split it 50% to the funeral home, 50% to the child or whomever they leave behind. At that point, if the funeral didn't cost whatever that 50% was, it still belongs to the funeral home. So do we understand and see the importance of not using your life insurance and actually pre-planning, prepaying for your funeral using a prepaid burial plan? So those things are, again, very important to do. Did that answer your question?
Yes. So do you just make an appointment with your funeral home to schedule a pre-need?
Yes. So you call your funeral home, and most funeral directors, some are not. I no longer hold a life insurance license in the state of Oklahoma, but staff members do. And so they will normally have someone on staff that is licensed as a life insurance agent to write your prepaid burial plan.
I heard you use the word irrevocable. Can you tell me what that is exactly? Because I just put my mother in a nursing home after being with her for 2 years, and I had to go to the funeral home where she did a irrevocable irrevocable something. They just kept saying it could be irrevocable, none, I didn't understand. But I got it because I knew what I needed to do at that time. So what is that exactly? Just kind of explain that to me.
Okay, so the difference between irrevocable and irrevocable, that has changed in the state of Oklahoma. It used to be that the requirement for people to enter a nursing home and receive Medicaid versus Medicare, you could only have $2,500
That's true.
across the board. If there was any other assets, the state could actually take possession of those. But if something is in irrevocable a status, such as your prepaid burial plan, they cannot touch it.
Oh,
Okay.
So that's the difference. So normally what we do is we place that into an irrevocable status so that it can't be touched. You have a question?
No, I just wanted to clarify, so we're in actuality talking about two different things. So one is somebody signing over their life insurance policy, and then, and it being, irrevocable, but I was trying to think of, for the funeral home, like where they just, everything could be given to the funeral home. And another is when you place somebody in a nursing home, I mean, like, that you're protecting assets, so you really have to be careful on what do you see what I'm saying? Because there were two.
Because you can also irrevocably assign the life insurance policy again. You can break out your beneficiaries, but you can irrevocably assign so much to the funeral home to pay for your funeral plan.
So when you're doing the pre-needs insurance plan policy and there's a beneficiary, who do you make the beneficiary? The funeral? You should not make the
That's
funeral
what
home.
she's saying.
You should make someone in your family the beneficiary.
For life insurance. For your prepaid burial plan, the funeral home that you've assigned to it, that's who will take that information and use it to pay for your service. So they can say, well, she pre-planned here in Oklahoma, so we just went through that, right? But you're in Texas. So what will happen is that funeral home will assign and pay to send those proceeds to the receiving or to the funeral home that you choose in Texas.
Okay, so there isn't necessarily a beneficiary per se.
There is, it becomes the funeral home on your prepaid plan.
This is a lot.
That's okay, keep asking questions. Again, it's a lot of information and, a lot of emotion involved in death. So to know now is better. Next slide. All right, so, you've received your information for planning. You've received all of the details about what to do, as far as purchasing merchandise and making sure that you have your disposition lined out, if it's going to be a burial or a cremation. And it's something, again, that I love about the state of Oklahoma. Don't forget that if you have family land or family property, you can be buried on your family property. So the only thing that you have to do is, if you ever sell the property, is disclose that information. So you don't even have to go to a cemetery if you don't want to. Okay. But you have all of the information about pre-funding your services. You get the information, figure out what you want to pay for. You do not have to pay for everything all at once. If you think, I just want to pay for my casket and my vault right now, you can do that. You do not have to pay for everything.
So if I wanted to bury somebody in the backyard,
If you want to bury somebody in your backyard, you could. It's certified on the death certificate.
So it tells us exactly where that person is. And again, you just have to disclose the information.
You can put a list on it.
Yes, it's your property,
So there's no rules on that.
not in this state.
So, Ms. Christie, if I have a parent that doesn't wanna disclose anything, but I know they paid for it at, say, Brookfield, will you give that information to me? If they just say, I'm done, I'm good, I got it taken care of, but you know, in my mind, it's not my parent, but I know somebody. In my mind, I'm very structured, I wanna know what you pay
You
for,
wanna make
because I
sure
don't
they
want
take care of.
to surprise.
We use discretion,
Okay.
and of course, confidentiality is very important. So we may not be able to tell you everything, but we can say, yes, this is covered, no, this is not covered for a loved one or someone that you're concerned about. And if you have to become financially responsible if they die. So
Do you have to show a power of attorney or anything? I know that's.
we suggest that, if you have one, yes. And put it on file with the funeral home. That way we can attach it to the prepaid burial plan. We can attach it to the information. Question?
So let's say, and I'm kind of piggybacking off her scenario of if the family is not necessarily aware of or cannot find any of the insurance paperwork. What usually happens to these policies that may exist if they're never found? They just go in cash, they go into unclaimed on the state, do they like kind of what happens, especially like with pre-need stuff and they prepay for things and you weren't aware that something's sitting out there?
Okay, so in that respect, there is nothing that you can do. It's just it just becomes income for, for the insurance company. Because it's not, when it's funded through a funeral home, we cannot receive those proceeds until we know they've passed away. So again, if someone, dies in another state, but they have a prepaid plan with us, it's insurance funded. So that requires a death certificate being sent to the insurance company. So those things, we never know. It's just a loss for the family and again, for us too. Anything else? Any other questions?
I don't have a question, but can I give a testimony?
Yes, you can give a testimony today.
Well, because, many of you know, I've buried several people over the last couple of years. So I have been involved in no insurance. I've been involved in insurance after a long, drawn-out illness. Insurance after a sudden death, as well as I helped a friend whose mother had a prepaid plan. Prepaid plan was by far the easiest situation that I dealt with. We were in and out in like 5
I want to piggyback on what she's saying also. If you don't have whole life insurance, I was a single parent and I got laid off in 2008, and I withdrew off my daughter's policy, and it carried us a long way. But I started it when she was 3, and by the time she was 16, I was able to put a down payment on a car. I was able to live off of that, and I'm telling you, I tell all young women that say I can't buy a house, I can't afford this, you can. And if you get a whole life insurance policy, that's a savings account that is, sometimes in our community, we don't save as well, but it's a form of saving until something big and major happens in your life that you need. So if you don't have whole life and you have little kids and grandbabies, get them a whole life insurance.
Yes,
It
yes.
helps me a lot.
Whole life insurance is the best thing, and I learned about this at a very young age. The reason being,
My father was going to start a business in 1959. The only thing he had was a whole life policy that had cash value. And because at the time, banks did not loan money to African Americans really for any reason, that cash value allowed him to purchase the equipment to actually start the business. So when I say that you can use your life insurance for legacy planning, that is definitely, yes, and for single mothers as well. So when you have small children, for yourself, again, if you go into your golden years into retirement and you realize, wow, I didn't save as much as I needed to, but I still need to keep this life insurance policy, that cash value will begin to pay for your premiums on the policy. So it's very important to have at least one whole life policy. And I know many who carry multiple. They'll do whole life, they'll do a term, again, which is much less expensive as far as premiums are concerned. But it is very important. And the last thing that I want to say about pre-planning, pre-burial is also to make sure, ensure that you have information from your funeral home to actually seek out aftercare. And that is for grief support. So that is one other very important thing to do. Because again, we have the costs, we have the things that we have to deal with as far as the business of a funeral. But it is very necessary as well to make sure that your mental well-being is intact. And because you have to take care of so many things during a death, it is very important to remember yourself and to remember to breathe and to have that support through a counseling service. We recently had a mother pass away. She had 5 children. And so those 5 children, it would be very important for them to receive some type of care. And even as adults, we still grieve. If our mothers and fathers were 90 years old when they passed away, they were still very near and dear to us. So it's important to grieve in a healthy way. There's nothing else. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Christie. That was a lot of information, but it was very needed and actually something that we in the African American community need to think about.
Actually, I might do, signals in on, powering off.
If you have not got a chance, please go out on Beta Sigma Omega's Facebook page as well as our YouTube channel and look at our first 3 installments in this estate planning series. Thank you. It's been a long day. It's very useful information. It's stuff that we actually need to really think about and not wait until the last minute. And with that being said, thank you guys for coming out and participating, and good night.